next. Behind this reunion selfie lies an untold story of time, fame, loss, and the lasting legacy of Fight Club 1999. There are some films that get older. And then there are films that do something stranger. They do not age politely. They do not settle down. They do not become comfortable. They stay volatile. They stay dangerous. They stay restless. And when we look back at them years later, it does not feel like revisiting a movie we once liked. It feels like meeting a younger version of anger itself. That is what Fight Club feels like. Not just a film from 1999. Not just a cult classic. Not just a dark satire about consumer culture, masculinity, insomnia, and self-destruction. It feels like a scream from the end of the 20th century that somehow still sounds modern. Still sharp. Still lonely. Still starving for meaning. And maybe that is why this reunion image feels so powerful. Brad Pitt standing beside the Tyler Durden of 1999. Not older in spirit, only older in face. Still carrying that impossible mix of seduction, danger, charm, and collapse. Edward Norton facing the younger narrator. That sleepless, hollow, over-civilized man, who looked like he was disappearing. Even before he split in two. Helena Bonham Carter looking back at Marla Singer. Still messy. Still magnetic. Still walking through smoke and ruin. Like someone who stopped pretending life was clean a long time ago. Jared Leto beside Angel Face. A flash of beauty in a world obsessed with damage. And somewhere in the shadow of the frame, Meat Loaf. Bob. Soft-hearted. Broken-hearted. Gone now. That is why Fight Club is not ordinary nostalgia. Because this is not a film people revisit to feel safe. They revisit it to feel exposed. When it first arrived in 1999, it did not arrive as a universally embraced masterpiece. It divided critics. It underperformed against studio expectations. Its marketing was famously troubled. And for a while, it looked less like a triumph than like a risk Hollywood did not quite know how to sell. But that is exactly what makes its story so perfect. For a then and now reunion. Because Fight Club, like the men inside it, was misunderstood when it was young. Too abrasive. Too confrontational, too unstable, too willing to make people uncomfortable. And then time did something remarkable. It did not soften the film. It clarified it. Home video gave it a second life. New generations found it. Arguments around it never stopped. And slowly, what first looked like a dangerous misfire began to look like something rarer. A work that had spoken too early, too harshly, and too truthfully, to be easily accepted on arrival. That is one reason Fight Club matters. Another is simpler. It did not just tell a story. It diagnosed a feeling. The numbness of modern life. The humiliation of corporate identity. The emptiness of buying things to feel real. The confusion of masculinity when it no longer knows what it is proving, or who it is trying to impress, or why pain starts to feel more honest than comfort. That is why the film lasted. Not because people wanted to imitate it literally, but because they recognized the wound underneath it. The narrator is not compelling because he is cool. He is compelling because he is empty. He has a job. An apartment, catalog taste, a routine, a face that still functions in polite society. And yet he is already vanishing. That is modern despair in one of its purest forms. Not dramatic ruin, but managed emptiness. Edward Norton understood that perfectly. He played the narrator as a man so over-adapted to the world that his soul had begun to rot quietly inside him, not loud enough for anyone to intervene, just loud enough to split him apart. And that is why the imagined reunion image between present-day Norton and 1999 Norton is so moving. Because it is not just an actor revisiting a famous role. It is a man standing beside a younger version of alienation, a version of loneliness, so refined, so articulate, so spiritually malnourished, that it had to invent a second self, just to feel alive. Edward Norton remains active, with IMDb listing current and recent work including Classroom 4, 2025, and ongoing producing work, which makes the image feel less like a farewell and more like a long conversation with one of the defining roles of his career. Then there is Tyler Durden. And that is where the film becomes immortal. Because Tyler is not simply a character. He is a fantasy, a seduction, a symptom, a lie powerful enough to feel like freedom. Brad Pitt did not just play Tyler as cool. He played him as the kind of cool that is already decaying from the inside. That is what people often miss. Tyler is charismatic, yes. Funny, yes. Electrifying, yes. But he is also a death wish. Speaking with perfect confidence. He is everything the narrator thinks he wants to be. When he is tired of shame, routine, weakness, and passivity. And because Pitt gave Tyler so much warmth, wit, sex appeal, and momentum, the audience understands why the fantasy works. You do not have to agree with Tyler to understand the danger of wanting to. That is part of the brilliance of Fight Club. It does not merely condemn the fantasy. It lets you feel it. It lets you feel why a culture full of dislocated, humiliated, spiritually adrift people might mistake destruction for liberation. And then it asks the harder question. What happens when rebellion itself becomes another prison? Brad Pitt is still very much active, with current and recent titles connected to F1, the movie, Wolves, and additional projects in development and production. That makes Tyler's then and now image especially powerful, because the actor moved forward through time, while the character remains frozen as one of cinema's most seductive embodiments of collapse. Then comes Marla Singer. And without Marla, the film would be impressive, but it would not be alive. Helena Bonham Carter gave Fight Club its rot, its humor, its intimacy, its smell of cigarettes, old clothes, emotional wreckage, and unwanted truth. Marla is not there to be a clean love interest. She is there to ruin the illusion of control. She sees through performance because she is one herself. She is pain dressed as indifference, need dressed as mockery, despair dressed as style. That is why she matters so much. In a film full of men trying to escape themselves through ideology, violence, fantasy, and hierarchy, Marla feels brutally real. She is not trying to build a new world. She is just trying to survive this one. And that gives the film one of its deepest emotional anchors. Helena Bonham Carter remains active as well, with IMDb listing recent and upcoming work including The White Lotus and Enola Holmes 3. So when you imagine present-day Helena beside Marla, it does not feel like faded chaos. It feels like the same strange intelligence, simply aged into another form. Then there is Bob. And this is where the reunion image begins to hurt. Because Bob is one of the film's most human presences. He is tenderness in a world trying to weaponize pain. He is grief in a world pretending grief can be beaten into meaning. He is one of the film's clearest reminders that beneath all the theory, all the swagger, all the slogans, there are bodies. Wounded bodies. Lonely bodies. Bodies that just want to be held, or seen, or allowed to cry. Meat Loaf gave Bob a softness the film needed desperately. And because Meat Loaf died on January 20th, 2022, at age 74, the then and now concept changes immediately when it reaches him. It stops being only about time. It becomes about absence. That is what makes Fight Club so much sadder now than it may have seemed when people first watched it. When you are young, the film can feel like adrenaline. When you are older, it starts to feel like grief. Grief for what men do to themselves when they no longer know how to be vulnerable. Grief for the ways consumer culture can flatten the soul. Grief for how easily pain becomes ideology. Grief for how quickly wounded people can turn to ritual, hierarchy, extremism, and myth, when ordinary life no longer gives them a language for suffering. That is why the film keeps deepening. Because beneath the shock, beneath the rules, beneath the basement fights, beneath the soap, the blood, the black humor, and the destruction, it is really about hunger. The hunger to feel real. The hunger to matter. The hunger to break the numbness. The hunger to be seen by another person. Without the packaging of success. That is not a dated feeling. That is why Fight Club still lands. And that is also why it satisfies the deepest things audiences want from great storytelling. They want emotion. And this film gives emotion in its harshest form: despair, rage, loneliness, humiliation, longing, and the brief intimacy that flickers between damaged people. They want meaning. And Fight Club overflows with it: identity, materialism, masculinity, fascistic temptation, alienation, and the search for authenticity in a hyper-commodified world. They want attraction, that pull that makes a story impossible to ignore. Few films have more of it. They want beauty. And yes, this film has beauty, but diseased beauty. Neon beauty. Broken tooth beauty. Warehouse beauty. A beauty built from grime, shadow, chemical light, and the seduction of collapse. They want connection. And this film connects precisely because so many people have felt some version of the emptiness it describes. And finally, they want afterglow. Though with Fight Club, that feeling is more like afterburn. It does not gently linger. It smolders. So who is still active? Among the faces most associated with Fight Club, Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, Helena Bonham Carter, and Jared Leto remain active in major film and television work. Meat Loaf is the key central cast loss audiences most readily associate with the film's memory today. And that gives the reunion image a very specific emotional shape. Unlike some classics that now feel mostly like memorials, Fight Club still feels alive. Still argumentative. Still unstable. Still culturally active. But no longer young in the same way. It has become something more unsettling. A youthful film that has aged into prophecy. Now comes the larger question. Has any film surpassed Fight Club? If we are talking about awards, absolutely. Fight Club had only one Oscar nomination, and it lost. If we are talking about box office, again yes, many films passed it easily. If we are talking about immediate critical consensus, it was never the kind of film that won that game cleanly in the first place. But if we are talking about cultural afterlife, about the ability of a film to survive argument, survive misunderstanding, survive moral panic, survive shifts in taste, and still remain part of the conversation, then Fight Club becomes much harder to surpass. Because it did not merely become famous. It became embedded. In quotes. In posters. In dorm rooms. In internet arguments. In essays about masculinity. In debates about satire. In discussions of toxic charisma. In the whole cultural vocabulary of late capitalist alienation. That is a different kind of victory. messier than awards, longer than trends, harder to measure, and often more durable. That may be the value at the center of Fight Club. Not that violence is liberating. Not that rebellion is pure. Not that modern life is hopeless. But something deeper and more painful. That people can be surrounded by comfort and still starve for meaning. That men can confuse numbness with strength until pain becomes the only thing that feels honest. That charisma without conscience can turn despair into a movement, and that the person we invent to save ourselves may become the very thing trying to erase us. That is why the selfie with time idea works so perfectly here. If Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, Helena Bonham Carter, Jared Leto, and the memory of Meat Loaf could all stand in one frame, if the living could face the younger selves the camera preserved in 1999, it would not just be a reunion photo. It would be a portrait of contradiction. Youth beside age. Seduction beside consequence. Beauty beside damage. Fantasy beside grief. The face we showed the world. Beside the fracture we tried to hide from it. And maybe that is the final legacy of Fight Club. It did not just shock people. It exposed them. It exposed the loneliness inside consumer identity. The instability inside performative masculinity. The danger inside charismatic nihilism. The desire, buried under all of it, to feel something real. So if one day these actors really stood shoulder to shoulder, with the younger versions of themselves, Brad with Tyler, Edward with the narrator, Helena with Marla, the living and the lost in the same impossible frame, the image would say more than nostalgia ever could. It would say, here is what you thought rebellion looked like. Here is what time taught it. Here is what survived the damage. And here is what still remains. After the fantasy burns down, the anger remains. The loneliness remains. The style remains. The ache remains. The hunger remains. And most of all, the question remains. Who are you? When everything you built your identity on turns out to be false? Do you think Fight Club is ultimately more about masculinity, consumer culture, identity, or the seduction of self-destruction? Which character feels the most haunting to you when you imagine their younger and older versions standing side by side? Has any film truly surpassed Fight Club in cultural afterlife and generational impact, or does it still occupy a category of its own?